This episode is brought to you by Bank of America. From a local business to a global corporation, partnering with Bank of America gives your operation access to exclusive digital tools, award-winning insights, and business solutions so powerful you'll make every move matter. Visit bankofamerica.com/bankingforbusiness to learn more. What would you like the power to do? Bank of America, N.A., copyright 2023.
You know, one of the beautiful things about learning Spanish or learning another language as an adult is that you're always learning, and your Spanish is your Spanish, you know? Like my Spanish is a layer of Chilean with like a little bit of Mexican sprinkled in there and a little bit of some Argentine and now some Spanish. Like it's always growing.
Welcome back to Working. I'm your host, Nate Chinen.
And I'm your other host, June Thomas.
June, whose voice was that at the top of the show?
Nate, that was Megan McDowell, a translator of literary fiction from Spanish. Her translation of Samantha Schweblin's Seven Empty Houses won the 2022 National Book Award for Translated Literature. But today's show actually has two guests. Megan is joined by Carlos Fonseca, one of the writers whose work she translates.
Oh, so we get 2 for 1 this episode.
Right.
I love it. And why did you want to talk with the two of them?
Well, the English translation of Carlos's latest novel, Austral, was published in May, and I wanted to take this opportunity to talk with a writer and their translator to explore that relationship and learn how they work together.
And I have a hunch that you also grabbed some bonus content for our Slate Plus members. What can they expect to hear?
Oh, you know me so well. I asked Carlos why translation is important to him. Why does he want his books to appear in languages other than the one it was written in? I also asked about translating non-textual elements. Austral includes some, I guess you could call them artistic artifacts that include words, and they too were translated. And it turns out that the story of how that came to be was really interesting.
I am definitely intrigued. And if you are too, please consider being a Slate Plus member. If you are already a member, make sure to stick around for that conversation at the end of the show. Now, how do you become one if you're not? Well, you can sign up today at slate.com/workingplus. You'll get exclusive members-only segments, bonus episodes of shows like Slow Burn and Big Mood, Little Mood, and you'll never hit a paywall on the Slate site. Also, if you become a Slate Plus member, you'll be supporting our work and the work of everyone at Slate. To learn more, go to slate.com/workingplus. All right, let's hear June's conversation with Carlos Fonseca and Megan McDowell.
Carlos Fonseca and Megan McDowell, welcome to Working.
Thank you so much for having us. This is really exciting.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jude. I'm so happy to be here.
So Carlos is the author of 3 novels, most recently Austral, and Megan is a much garlanded translator, including of Carlos's 3 novels. I'm very excited to talk to you both because I've long been fascinated with the relationship between writers and translators. First, Megan, how long have you been working with Carlos, and what were the origins of this working relationship?
Well, it's a unique origin story. And I think we first got in contact, I would say, in 2012. And Carlos, he had finished a draft of his first novel, but it wasn't even published in Spanish. So he wrote me, I was living in Switzerland then, and he wrote me and asked if he could send me a copy. And I said, of course. And so he sent it to me, asked me if I would translate it. And I loved the book and said, sure, I'll do that. And this is the only time this has happened for me where the English translation existed before the book was even published in Spanish.
Wow.
And then a couple years later, no, not even. It was published by Anagrama, the best Spanish language publisher. And I think maybe a year after that, it finally came out in English. But there was a long time where it only existed in our computers.
Wow. So, Carlos, why did you send this book that was only written and not yet published? Why did you send this to Megan?
Yeah, it was funny. I was trying to think about it now, and I think it was because my wife, Ati, she doesn't speak Spanish nor read Spanish. And, I had to explain to her why I had been spending so much time, away from home and with the computers. So that's when I contacted Megan. I had read Megan's wonderful translation of an author that I really respect and admire, who is Alejandro Zambra. I think Ways of Coming Home had just been released or was in the process
Ways of
being
Going
released.
Home.
Yeah. So I loved it. And I said, this is the person. And I was extremely lucky because, if I even tried that nowadays with the amount of, work that Megan has, it would have been impossible. But, so it has been more than 10 years and 3 novels. And it's wonderful, to work with her. And I now always say that I have a little Megan McDowell in my mind, even when I write in Spanish, because, it's an interesting process of self-editing that goes through it. And it's just great.
So how do you two collaborate? We should note that you two do not live in the same country, continent, or time zone. And when in the writing process do you start first talking about the translation?
I think usually once I have finished the novel and the novel is printed and going, or about to go into print. So that process, either last edits or once it is published, I want her to be, of course, one of the first readers after my editor has read it. And then the first thing that I always tell Megan is, I'm open to changes. And I always see the translation process as an open-ended possibility of keep editing the book, right? I feel we send the books to print, but there's so many other things that we could change, and opening again for translation is one of those opportunities.
Wow. So, Megan, when Carlos has suggested that he would almost take your edits, can you think of a time when that has happened, and what sort of kind of thing you suggested to him for the translation?
Well, so I think that a lot of times as I'm reading and as I'm translating, the thing is, when you're translating a book, you read it more closely than probably any other reader does, even an editor. And because I have to build this sort of house of cards in my head. I have to get everyone's timeline straight. I have to build a choreography of, the movement of the characters and the layout of houses. I always say that when I'm translating a book, I want to know in my head everything that the writer knew when they were writing it, which is impossible, but it means that I ask a lot of questions, and a lot of times I want to have clear things that don't even appear in the text. I want to know a lot of other stuff. So Carlos is really open to, if something is not clear for me, he's always open to adding something in the text that does make that clear. Sometimes I get confused about a timeline. Austral is a book that has a lot of, different moments in history. It's told in almost a spiraling way. It's if you think of a camera that pulls out and then goes in on a moment, and then pulls out and then goes in on another moment. And I feel for me, I want to have those timelines and those moments as clear in the close-up and also clear in terms of the timeline. So I think, to answer your question, a lot of what I add is sort of markers in time, markers in space, things that make things clearer to me.
So sometimes it's kind of for your understanding as much as anything else. Some of the things might change the text, but some of the things are to help you be sure that you understand the text so that you can then transmit it in this other language.
Right. And it's a fine line to walk, because as a translator, that's my job, is to make something, comprehensible to someone who in theory can't read it. part of my job is also as a literary translator to maintain the ambiguity that's there in the original, So I don't want to add, too much explanation that's unnecessary. Mm-hmm. I do have this tendency to want to make things as clear as possible. So I feel like that's a kind of a constant conversation that we have. I don't know. What do you think, Carlos?
I think that's a good explanation because I have the tendency to always make things as complex as possible. So, yeah. I don't try to. It's not like somebody just comes out that way. So, for example, I have very good memories of right now of working with you, Megan, on Natural History, the novel that came before. And that was a very kind of lengthy novels and also with many different time settings and historical episodes that resonate many years later. And Megan is just so good with her chronology, but also so good at spotting inconsistencies. So she's if the kid is 10 years old here, how come 20 years later, the mother is calling her a teenager and stuff like that? And I was oh God, you're completely right. And then I'm trying to figure out, of course, if I change that, then is there any domino effect, right? So it's a lot of fun doing that sort of editing, but also kind of always stressful how,
yes.
the amount of little things that the detective is going to find.
Yeah. Well, Carlos, one of the things that I'm conscious of is that often when I talk to writers, especially fiction writers, when I'm asking them about the book. And of course, maybe they're doing publicity for the book. So they're in that moment with the work that we're talking about. But in many ways, they're ready to move on. They want to get to their next project. They want to leave that world behind and move on to the next book. But in a way, what you're saying is you kind of stay with the book for maybe another year, maybe longer while you're working with Megan. Do you ever kind of resent that extra time that you spend with this book when you could be working on your next one in Spanish?
I think it's it's still the good thing is that it can make it better, right? I think what drives us crazy about finished projects is that somehow they're set in stone, and the things that we think we failed at, we are always ever so evident for us, right? Whereas with translation, at least you have the sense of oh God, that little thing that I really disliked, then can be, can be bettered. And it gives another life to the book. You never know, where people are gonna read it in a different way where it was read. So there's a certain amount of hope and surprise, and that's exciting.
Yeah. It's something I'm curious about. Carlos is evidently extraordinarily fluent in English. Megan, do you have a preference for whether the writer you're translating should know the target language? Does it make your job easier or harder?
Ooh. Well, since I work into English, I think most people have some experience of English, but I have translated a few authors who don't speak English, and I ask my questions in Spanish. I try to keep that conversation in Spanish. I try to explain my questions in Spanish. So Carlos has a real understanding of translation and what it does and what happens in translation. I feel like when I have translated people who don't really speak English, they don't understand a lot of times what I'm asking, in the sense that I'll get a lot of answers. When I'm trying to ask these kind of backstory questions, they'll say, oh, just leave it how it is. Don't change anything. And obviously I'm changing every word, but people have a hard time understanding why these questions that I'm asking can have an effect on the text. The important thing to me is just to be able to talk to writers. I work almost exclusively on living writers. And to me, hearing their voices, whether it's in English or in Spanish, and to be able to talk to them about what they were thinking as they were writing, just helps open up the translation so much. And like Carlos is saying, it's an ongoing conversation. In a certain way, these deadlines and publication dates are imposed and false. And the text is malleable and it's ongoing in a way that if you're working on, a text that was written in 1930, it's more closed, it's more written in stone. And I think that's just a process that we both enjoy.
I had a question for Megan. Now I was thinking, does it help you when you hear the writers reading out loud in the, let's say in Spanish, like the texts, just because I would imagine that it's the moment in which you say, this is how like at least they're thinking about it in their minds.
Yes, that does help. That does help. And even not even necessarily reading the text, but just hearing the cadence of their voice. This is a little woo-woo that I'm getting into now, but now when I start translating a writer who I don't know, I always make sure to have a conversation with them over Zoom or to send audio messages because I need their voice in my head. It helps me as I'm translating a lot. It's amazing. Like moments that I was struggling with before, once I have that voice in my head, it just kind of opens it up. And I don't really know why, but I have it very clear.
We'll be right back with more of June's conversation with Carlos Fonseca and Megan McDowell.
This podcast is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Whether you're driving, cooking, or doing laundry, Progressive knows the podcasts you listen to go best when they're bundled with another activity, much like how their Progressive home and auto policies go best when they're bundled. Having these two policies together makes taking care of your insurance easier and could help you save too. Customers who save by switching their home and car insurance to Progressive save nearly $800 on average. That's a whole lot of savings and protection for your favorite podcast listening activities like going on a road trip, cooking dinner, and even hitting the home gym. Yep, your home and your car are even easier to protect when you bundle your insurance together. Find your perfect combo. Get a home and car insurance quote at progressive.com today. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. National average 12-month savings of $793 by new customers surveyed who saved with Progressive between June 2021 and May 2022. Potential savings will vary.
This episode of Working is brought to you by Factor. With the busy fall season just around the corner, you might be looking for wholesome, convenient meals for jam-packed days. Factor, America's #1 ready-to-eat meal kit, can help you fuel up fast with chef-prepared, dietitian-approved, ready-to-eat meals delivered straight to your door. You'll save time, eat well, and stay on track with your healthy lifestyle. Listeners, you've probably heard me say this a couple times before if you're a long-time working person, but I am always skeptical of food that one is supposed to heat up in the microwave that is not leftovers that you cooked yourself. But I have to admit, I tried Factor, they sent it to me, and I really liked it, and they have a lot of options available to you. Are you a vegan? They have vegan stuff. Do you want calorie conscious stuff? They have that. You can also round out your meal and replenish your snack supply with an assortment of over 45 add-ons, including breakfast items like apple cinnamon pancakes and bacon and cheddar egg bites. And for an easy wellness boost, you could even add refreshing beverage options, cold pressed juices, shakes, and smoothies. This August, get Factor and enjoy eating well without the hassle. Head to factormeals.com/working50 and use code working50 to get 50% off. That's code working50 at factormeals.com/working50 to get 50% off.
Listeners, we want to hear from you. Every other Thursday on Working Overtime, we answer listener questions, so please tell us your creative challenges and let us help you. Drop us a line at working@slate.com, or you can send a voice memo to that address. Or give us a ring at 304-933-WORK. And if you're enjoying this episode, don't forget to subscribe to Working wherever you get your podcasts. I also want to say a quick hello to our listeners on Stitcher. As you may have heard, the Stitcher app is going away on August 29th, but fear not, you'll still be able to find us. Listen and subscribe to Working on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, or anywhere else you find podcasts. And thank you so much for being a loyal listener. Okay, back to June's conversation with Megan McDowell and Carlos Fonseca.
Well, this is a perfect time for me to ask you to read some of the book. I would love to hear, Carlos, if you would mind reading a selection from Austral, and then Megan, perhaps we could hear your translation of that same excerpt.
Sure. We chose just one short paragraph.
Basically, like towards the end of the novel, the protagonist arrives to this memory theater where like a survivor from the genocide, of Guatemalan genocide, is trying to reconstruct the memories according to this tradition of the Greeks of constructing like literally a space where memory is conjured. So I'm just gonna like read in Spanish that the moment in which he enters that space. Sobre la base circular de la cúpula que cubría la plataforma central del teatro, encontró tallada una cita. Así es el relato de lo que todavía está en suspenso, de lo que todavía está callado, de lo que está silencioso, de lo que todavía está sosegado, de lo que todavía está en silencio, de lo que está vacío en el cielo. Popol Vuh. La madera había sido esculpida por una mano diestra en el arte del grabado. Julio persiguió una por una las letras de esa escritura circular hasta que llegando al final se topó con el principio y sintió que también la cinta del grabador volvía a rebobinar antes de empezar su loop, inundando la sala nuevamente con los testimonios que había escuchado hacía apenas unos instantes. Voces como ecos que laboriosamente intentaban recomponer, mediante el trazado de escenas a primera instancia anodinas, la arquitectura del fantasma que parecía esconderse en torno a él.
And in English. On the base of the cupola that arched over the theater's central stage, he found an engraved quotation. This is the account of when all is still, silent, and placid. All is silent and calm, hushed and empty as the womb of the sky. Popol Vuh. The wood had been sculpted by a skilled hand. One by one, Julio followed the letters of that circular writing until, reaching the end, he ran into the beginning and heard the tape recorder also rewind before starting its loop again, flooding the hall with the testimonies he had heard in the background just moments before. Voices like echoes tracing scenes that at first seemed anodyne, trying laboriously to recompose the spectral architecture that seemed to be hidden all around him.
Thank you for that. You mentioned this earlier, Megan, but Austral has multiple narrators. It's kind of a spiral, as you said. Obviously, Carlos makes each narrator sound different in a way when he writes those sections. You know, each of the narrators has a different voice that's writing, right? Does that affect how you approach the translation? Do you approach each voice differently when it's different, or is your imperative always the same to represent Carlos's voice?
That's a good question. I think some of that emerges in the process. It is something that I'm conscious of, especially because in this book, at one point he comments, the diary entries have the style of. And I think it's Celine and Faulkner, and it kind of this kind of run-on torrential kind of style. So, you know, some of that happens. The sentences are very long. There's a lot of clauses. And the diary entries are a little more poetic and they're more stream of consciousness almost. So it's something that I'm aware of. And I think those parts were a little more difficult to translate because the syntax is more complex. But it's something that I'm aware of all the time as I'm translating Carlos, because in a way that is his voice. It's to put layer upon layer. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of why why we chose this section to read, because you have the different layers. You have the citation of history in the Popol Vuh, and you have the testimonies that are going on a loop in the background. And, you know, you have the visual representation of this, you know, and the quotation that goes around and then returns to the beginning.
Did any of that surprise you, Carlos?
No, it was beautiful, for example, to see when Megan mentioned, I had forgotten that I mentioned that the style is the style of Faulkner, right? But it's something that I always have present, particularly when I'm working in the different layers, how not to confuse them. And I always remember, for example, now I'm writing, yesterday I was writing, and I noticed when I was re-editing what I had written the day before, I was this kind of resonates too much with that. And then a little bit of me or a part of me said remember to tell Megan, or I hope Megan also notices this, right? And I'm probably going to forget that I had to tell Meg that this is something to notice. But it's interesting that indirectly her process of translation must mimic those moments of decisions, but of course within a different context, which is the different language, right? Sometimes it's a matter of alliteration that shouldn't be there, but my work in Spanish or not in English, but maybe in English, then it starts to alliterate. So it's interesting that you end up like kind of like putting yourself in trouble, and the capacity then of like, you know, the sort of labor of writing or labor of translating is also getting yourself out of those issues.
I must reveal my ignorance that I'm not familiar with the writers that you translate, Megan, but I'm very aware that Spanish is a very, you know, when we say Spanish, we're actually talking, in fact, about many different languages effectively. You know, I speak Spanish, but I learned Spanish in Spain. So my peninsular Spanish is very different from South American Spanish, but also, Carlos, when you were speaking Spanish, I heard a little bit of Spanish here and there. I think you said voces or something. Obviously, you have a very, I almost want to say, multinational upbringing. You know, you lived in different countries. So I guess I have two questions. For you, Megan, is there a particular kind of Spanish that you specialize in, and where does Carlos fit into it? And then, Carlos, are you aware of kind of having a particular voice that is based on where you grew up in Spanish, and do you expect to see it in English? But Megan, you first.
Well, I learned Spanish in Chile. So originally, I specialized kind of in Chilean writers. My first writer was Alejandro Zambra, and I've worked with him on, I think, maybe 8 books now. And then, you know, geographically, I've kind of spread out from there. Now I have 2 Argentine writers, Samantha Schreblin and Mariana Enriquez, who I've worked with on several books of theirs too. And I would say that, you know, Chilean Spanish is where I feel kind of most at home. I don't know if this is as true now, but it has typically been the Spanish that I've heard in my head. This year I spent 4 months in Spain, and I think that has changed a lot. With Carlos, to me, his Spanish is pretty neutral. You know, like it's not necessarily a Caribbean Spanish. In this book, he brings in a Chilean word, huevón. There's a moment, and he's conscious.
And you're very influenced by the Argentinians, clearly, too. I mean, Ivone Borges and others.
Yeah. And he can play with that a little bit, but you can tell me if you think this is true, Carlos. But compared to some of like, you know, Cuban or Caribbean Spanishes that I've worked a little bit with, I feel like your Spanish is a little more neutral. And maybe it's because you spent so much time living in an English-speaking world.
Yeah, I think like it has to do with 2 things. It has to do first with the fact that like, you know, even in my house, my mother would speak like Puerto Rican Spanish, but my father would speak Costa Rican Spanish. So very early on, I was like, you know, kind of deciding between these 2 things. And we moved from Costa Rica to Puerto Rico very early on. So there was always this sort of like, you know, hybridity in terms of language. And maybe I opted for like at the moment of writing for like, you know, a more neutral Spanish. But I always remember something that another one of the like great writers that Megan translates mentions sometimes, Samantha Schweblin. Samantha has also lived outside of Argentina for a long time. And one of the things she always like underlines is how like then like abroad in the sort of diaspora, like you start hanging out with all sort of Latin Americans, and like Spanish becomes that. Spanish becomes like borrowing a word like huevón from like a Chilean friend, something from an Argentinian friend. And I feel comfortable there. I feel like comfortable with that sort of like Spanish that it's not like, you know, completely like delocalized, but it has the capacity to like kind of camouflage itself in different places. But having said that, it also I think has to do with my style. Like I don't do, for example, so far I haven't done so much dialogue. In Austral, at the very end, I do get into these monologues. And there I had to like then like kind of localize myself like more closely to within Guatemala. For example, I mentioned I was writing something, and in this manuscript, it's much more monologues, and it's based in Puerto Rico. So suddenly I was like, I need to like kind of like go back there and kind of like to that place in me that is still located in Puerto Rico and kind of like get that resonance.
Well, tell us, Carlos, where did you grow up? What are the traditions that you are coming from?
Yeah, well, so I come from a family where my father is Costa Rican, as I mentioned, and my mom is Puerto Rican. I was born in Costa Rica, and I was there until I was 7. And then I moved to Puerto Rico. And in terms of the Spanish, it was very funny because Central American Spanish, and particularly Costa Rican Spanish, is a little bit different. It's not so much Caribbean. People use the vos instead of the tú, right? Voceamos. So very early on, I was always trapped. In Puerto Rico, people thought I was Costa Rican. And then in Costa Rica, people thought I was Puerto Rican. So it was a little bit of a mess. And to make things more complex, I moved to the States when I was 18. That kind of solved the issue because then people couldn't even distinguish sometimes between Costa Rica and Puerto Rico. And they would tell me, oh, you're Latin American. I was like, well, I guess like that's a good way of thinking about it. And now I'm in England, married to an Israeli. Right. So it's like all over the place. and my kids speak like a sort of Ladino mixture between Hebrew and Spanish and English. And I like that. I think that's what it's all about, right? And being able to navigate that. And I guess what is more important for me is to continue writing in Spanish, although I have been out. This year, it's 18 years and I'm 36, so it's 18 and 18. Next year, I'll be more out in English-speaking countries than in Latin America, a little bit like Julio.
Right. Yes, we note some similarities. Carlos, do you think of Austral and Austral being the same book, or are they different because of the language that they're written in?
No, I think of them as the same book. One, like, it depends on like the angle from which you look at it. And I think what I was saying before, it's a different opportunity for books to interact with like different audiences that come from different traditions, right? So when an author in Latin America picks that book, Austral, they might be thinking, oh, this reminds me of like the works of like, or Piglia or this. But when it lands in the US or the UK, it might interact with authors who have read other stuff, right? So it's almost like a different chemical reaction. And that's always exciting, right? It's a different readership, which is the best you can ask for.
Megan, we've mentioned that Austral is the third book of Carlos's that you've translated. Does it get easier, or are they all different? Did you approach the third book differently than the first?
Well, that's a difficult question to answer. I would say that, yes, I approach them differently because I have changed as a translator since, 2012. I am a little more sure of myself, which ironically means that I ask a lot more questions. Because, I used to think, I need to know everything. I have to know everything. If I ask questions, it's just, admitting my fallibilities. And now I feel like I want to know everything and I'm secure in what I don't know, if that makes sense. Yeah. Also, the first time I didn't really know Carlos, and now we're friends and we've been working together for a really long time, and our friendship goes beyond the books. So that helps. I think that probably, I don't know, I don't like to talk about translation in terms of easy or difficult, because a lot of times people offer me a translation or they ask me to do something and they'll say, it's an easy translation. And it never is. And I don't know if that's something wrong with me but there's always something that you don't see coming. It's not until you get deep into the book that you encounter its, difficulties. I'm not sure that an easy translation really exists, but I think I'm more comfortable translating Carlos now. And I also know his obsessions. And, because all the books are different, but there's usually photography will make an appearance, or art in general. The archives, this kind of sense of familiarity probably makes it easier, if we want to use that adjective, or, more comfortable, more friendly.
Carlos, you kind of mentioned this before, and I now, having spoken with you, I have a sense that your Costa Rican and Puerto Rican pride, they've already kind of informed the answer, but you live and teach in Cambridge, England. You're speaking English all the time. You're surrounded, I imagine, by the English language. Do you think you'll ever do a Beckett or a Nabokov and write in a language other than your native tongue?
Well, if you could guarantee me that I would write like Beckett or Nabokov, then I would. But sadly, since I don't think I can, I think I'll stick to Spanish. I don't know. For me, it's my way of staying there, right? It's something that I respect, that I am lucky enough that economically I have this position at the university, so I don't need to earn a living directly from my writing. That might be one of the reasons that would inform switching into English. So I don't know, I love that connection. Sometimes, for example, since at home I speak mostly in English except with the kids, sometimes I can spend a whole week without speaking Spanish and only then the relationship to Spanish goes through reading and writing. So sometimes I feel if I were to then suddenly start writing in English, even that connection might be broken. So, they say never, but in my particular case, I would be quite surprised if suddenly I decide to start writing English. I write in English a lot. I write articles in English, but I always had that distinction between writing articles in English. So my academic life was in that language. Yeah. And then literature and fiction or personal essays to be in the language of my infancy.
Carlos Fonseca, Megan McDowell, thank you so much. This was so interesting. I love this conversation. Thank you very much for joining us on Working.
Thank you so much for having us. This was really fun.
Yeah, thanks so much, June. Lovely to meet you, and so good, to have another excuse to always see Megan.
Coming up next, June and I will talk about translation as a creative act, the upside of collaborative tension, and the malleability of language.
At the end of your first year, Discover credit cards automatically double all the cash back you've earned. That's right, everything you earned doubled. All the cash back from eating at your favorite soup dumpling restaurant doubled. All the cash back from that trip where you sort of learned to snowboard also doubled. And the best part, you don't have to do anything ridiculous to get it. Nope, Discover does it automatically. Seriously though, see terms and check it out for yourself at discover.com/match. This episode is brought to you by Bank of America. If you own or operate a business, whether it's a local operation or a global corporation, partnering with Bank of America could be your smartest move. By teaming with Bank of America, you'll enjoy exclusive digital tools, award-winning insights, and business solutions so powerful you'll make every move matter. Position your business to capitalize on opportunity in a moment's notice. Visit bankofamerica.com/bankingforbusiness to learn more. What would you like the power to do? Bank of America, N.A., copyright 2023.
June, I loved this conversation, which is so deeply about language and culture in active dialogue. Just fascinating. But before we get into that, I have to ask something a lot more basic. Early in your interview, Carlos confesses that he has a natural instinct to complexify, while Megan is a stickler for clarity. So this is set up like a classic odd couple scenario, but I know they aren't actually in conflict. What lessons do you think their productive tensions might hold for those of us working in a different field?
That was really a lovely expression of why, or at least one reason why two people work well together. Liking and respecting each other doesn't guarantee a fruitful relationship. I think those things are necessary, but they're not enough. At one point in the interview, Megan mentioned a woo-woo idea, and that gives me permission to suggest that there might be a bit of a woo-woo response, something that's not quite definable. In a productive collaborative relationship, which could be editing or producing or curating or anything, you have to be complementary in those areas that are, for whatever reason, important to the people involved. If sticking to a timetable is incredibly important to you, collaborating with someone who has a very loose relationship with deadlines, it just won't work. And obviously that's a random kind of petty example, but for most of us, there's something that just bugs us and we really can't change. And you just have to be compatible on those non-negotiable things. And so it really impressed me that Carlos understood that They do have those differing perspectives, and that's so useful.
And, they don't talk about it in terms suggestive of a compromise,
right?
Which also seems really key.
Yes.
Well, you are aware that I have some formative experience as a co-author. So naturally, I perked up when Megan talked about the generous give and take of translation and, how she differentiates between a living text and one that's more fixed. So I wanted to know, having read Austral, do you feel that intimacy? Do you sense it as a reader? Does it feel more, more alive than, for instance, a new English translation of a classic work?
Oh, man, your question has made me realize something. I read quite a few translated works. In fact, I once worked at a small press that published books in translation, but I think that almost all of my reading has been of living writers. But that said, Megan's translation is absolutely alive. I was carried along by its beating heart as I was reading. She did a wonderful job. I'm not sure if what I'm about to say is a compliment, but I was never aware that I was reading a translation. I was just completely transported into its fictional world. And Austral is it's just a wonderful book. It really spoke to me as someone who has somewhat recently returned to a place and a culture that I left several decades before. Not everyone will have that exact experience, but when you can, obviously that's kind of a magical thing. But before we move on, Nate, I'm glad you mentioned your experience as a co-author. You worked with the jazz and music festival impresario George Wein on his memoir, Myself Among Others, A Life in Music. And in my head, at least, that is akin to working as a kind of translator. You were helping George translate his life experiences onto the page. Were there similarities between that experience and the kind of collaboration that Carlos and Megan described?
That's such a fascinating framing. And I certainly did not think of it as translation at the time. That book came out exactly 20 years ago. And I started working on it a few years before that. I started in my early 20s, and there were similarities in the sense that the really detail-oriented, but also kind of mystical aspects of collaboration that they describe, that really struck a chord with me, because as a co-author, you are seeking to be a catalyst and an amplifier, and also sort of invisible. When you said you're not sure if it's a compliment, I'm almost certain that Megan would say that it is. Yeah. She doesn't want you to notice her work. And so it was an interesting process of sublimation in a way. And the only way to get there, I found, was to really, really get to know George as a person, as a writer, as a thinker and conversationalist, so that I could not only rearrange the transcriptions that we'd made into some kind of literary form, but I could actually sort of ventriloquize his stories and experiences. And so there was a sort of transubstantiation going on there, I guess.
Totally. Yeah. And now what you've just said has helped me kind of appreciate even more what Megan said about liking to have some kind of conversation. It doesn't even have to be about the book, but just so you get the author's rhythms and their voice. She gets that in her head. And that now makes sense with what you said about getting George's words onto the paper.
Absolutely. And if the writer is alive, as they tend to be in Megan's case, why would you not avail yourself of that access and that information? But she also made a good point about how a translator is really the closest of close readers. The text really is the core thing. And so, it's funny, I almost think of it like how your auto mechanic understands your car even better than you do, So, June, you and I are both writers. Do you see this as analogous to, one of our core relationships between a writer and a really good editor? Or how is it distinct? And what do you think we might learn from it, even if we're working strictly in one tongue as a writer?
I mean, absolutely. I think it's very similar. As a writer, I can think of nothing better than working with an editor who is demanding and who pushes you a little bit, just to take an idea one or two steps further, or provide more evidence for an assertion, or someone who tells you when your jokes just don't work, whether you want to hear that or not,
Right.
You don't always want to do that work. And especially because they often come into the process when you're like just a bit worn out, especially if it's a big project. But if you have an editor who you trust, that to me is like the best part of writing. And I have never understood those writers who make a big thing about, oh, they don't want to be edited. They think they don't need professional editors. To me, that's just foolish. And there's an important commonality, which is that while the job of a translator or an editor is to make the work as good as it can be, it's ultimately not their work. Translators and editors are typically great writers. But when they're translating or editing, they're working in service of the author and their writing. So you do have to kind of stand back a little bit. And, that's not for everyone. As to the lesson of that experience, this is really hard for me to say because I'm pretty much a hermit, but I would say that you should always look for feedback from someone. That might be a skilled professional editor. That to me is the apex experience. But if you don't have access to that kind of person, to that kind of role, you might look to get feedback from a writer's group or another writer who you trust or a friend who has good taste and knows you and knows what you're trying to do. Or if you have the means, hire someone to give you editorial feedback. But I think it's really important to get a perspective that isn't only inside your own head. And I don't always want that, but it's really good.
No, it's very true. And I also work as an editor, and that's been really valuable to have that perspective on the other side of the glass, so to speak, and realize like, oh, there's really no reason to be defensive going into the feedback process. Yeah,
that really is lesson one.
I'm also really glad that you brought up the cosmopolitan dimension of the Spanish language.
Yes.
We're really not talking about a monolith. And Carlos has such a unique personal experience with that. And it's striking how he seems to draw a distinction between his work as a novelist and some of his other writing, much of which he does in English. And does he teach at Cambridge?
Yes.
So what does it mean to bring someone like Megan in as a partner in that process? Like strictly speaking, he doesn't quote unquote need her to get the work done. Yeah. So what is the motivation? I get the sense neither of them would describe her as an interloper here.
Yeah, I feel pretty sure that that's true. And that was a fascinating insight to me. Language is a very tangible expression of our roots. I'm guessing that the different flavor of Spanish wasn't the only difference between the years that Carlos spent in Costa Rica and those in Puerto Rico, or the different ancestral roots he had in those places. The Spanish language wasn't the only thing he left behind when he moved to the States at 18. But language is a nice proxy for all those other things. You can explore a lot of ideas by thinking about the language you used in those places. It's almost grounding. And I was really interested in the notion of holding on to his origins by writing fiction in the language he grew up in, using at home, whereas doing academic work in English isn't freighted in anything like the same way. So then getting to bring in Megan, who in a way is a bridge between those two worlds, the part of him where his fiction lives and the language he uses most of the time. Honestly, that almost seems like a therapeutic role, but that too is just part of it because Megan's skills then allow more people to experience Spanish language, Carlos. I don't know. It's very complicated. It's fascinating. And clearly it works really well.
Yeah. Well, hearing their banter and, as you're speaking with them, it just feels like the two of them know how to hang.
Yeah.
There's a lot of, a really incredible amount of work that clearly went into this project, but you feel like every time the two of them, logged onto a Zoom session together or what have you, they really looked forward to it and enjoyed the whole process.
Yeah, that's the impression I have too.
Well, speaking of which, June, I have thoroughly enjoyed our hang here today, but that is about all the time we have for today's show. Before we go, though, just one more reminder that if you join Slate Plus, you will get to hear all of our episodes ad-free. You'll also get to hear exclusive segments on our show and a lot of other Slate podcasts, and you'll get to hear entire bonus episodes of shows like Slow Burn and Big Mood, Little Mood. Of course, you will also get full access to all of the articles on Slate.com. Sign up today at slate.com/workingplus.
Thank you to Carlos Fonseca and Megan McDowell for being our guests this week. And thanks to our producer for this episode, Kevin Bendis, and to our series producer, Cameron Drews, for making sure that nothing gets lost in translation. We'll be back next week for Nate's conversation with trombonist and composer Kalia Van Dever. Until then, get back to work.
It's time to get your checking account to zero with free checking from PenFed. That's zero ATM fees, zero balance requirements, and zero time spent waiting for your paycheck to direct deposit because you can receive it up to 2 days early. Open your account with just $25 and see how big zero can be. Apply online today at PenFed.org/free checking. Early direct deposit eligibility may vary between pay periods and timing of payers' funding. To receive any advertised product, you must become a member of PenFed, insured by NCUA.
Hey everybody, it's Tim Heidecker. You know me, Tim and Eric, Bridesmaids, and Fantastic Four. I'd like to personally invite you to listen to Office Hours Live with me and my co-hosts, DJ Doug Pound.
Hello.
And Vic Berger.
Howdy.
Every week we bring you laughs, fun, games, and lots of other surprises. It's live. We take your Zoom calls.
Music.
We love having fun. Excuse me?
Songs. Vic said something.
Songs.
Music.
I like having fun. I like to laugh. I like to meet people who can make me laugh. Please subscribe now.